Welcome back, fellow conspiracy realists. Tonight's classic episode is, I think, a great window into unprecedented times. Hashtag no pun left behind.
Unprecedented presidential chaotic times. Yeah. Can a president pardon themselves is a question that, got a lot more exploration when it became kind of a little more of a possibility that it might happen. And this is really laying out the groundwork of the argument, for and against this concept.
And the answer is, yeah, obviously a president can pardon themselves, right? We don't even need this episode. Let's get out of here.
No, it's not quite as simple as that. It's just some nuance to this convo.
Yeah, we're speaking with Professor Brian C. Kalt, who is, I would say, still the top legal mind on this very specific question. And Professor Kalt points out several times things that just sound weird if you weren't born in the U.S. or live here where it's normalized. Like, talk to somebody from any other part of the world and look at their reaction when you say, well, yeah, kind of, U.S. president can be a felon and can run for office.
They just can't be from Austria.
Right. They just can't be Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Dang.
From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
Welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We are joined with our super producer, Paul, pardon me, Decant. And most importantly, you are here, you are you, and that makes this stuff they don't want you to know. This is a very special episode for us today, friends and neighbors. In a way, it is a follow-up, or I would say a spiritual successor.
I love that.
To an earlier episode that we did. Back in 2017, we explored the strange case of Yellowstone's Zone of Death, a small area of land in rural America where an odd loophole allows, what's the best way to say, guys? Allows, in theory, someone to commit a crime and avoid prosecution.
Yeah, sort of like a purge zone where you could just, all bets are off.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Willy-nilly, crime town. USA. Yeah. But as it turns out, with today's question, not quite so simple. So maybe listen back to that episode if you haven't heard it in a minute.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and spoiler alert for all of you would-be supervillains in the crowd today, it will not work in practice. Do not attempt it. However, in this episode, we relied heavily on the work of Professor Brian C. Kalt, the man who discovered the loophole in the first place.
And he actually wrote back to us and gave us a few, what would you call them? Just some feedback on some of the things we discussed. One of the major ones is it's definitely cult, as in salt, cult.
Yes. And this, when we received this email, we were delighted because in the course of our research for the Yellowstone episode, we learned more about the professor's work, not just concerning the zone of death. We learned that for years, Professor Kalt has investigated a question increasingly important and relevant in the realm of American politics. It is this: can a president pardon him or herself? And that's what we're looking at today. But today, you see, we are lucky enough to go directly to the primary source. Friends and neighbors, we would like to introduce you to Professor Brian Kalt. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Professor.
Oh, thanks, guys. Glad to be here.
First off, can you tell us, just in your own words, what you do every day? What are you studying? What are you teaching?
Well, I'm a law professor at Michigan State University, and I teach torts and administrative law, but my research has pretty much always focused on constitutional law, and more recently, the constitutional law of the presidency, things like pardons, impeachment, 25th Amendment, that sort of stuff.
Fantastic. So first things first, Professor, I think what would benefit everyone in our audience right now would be to know in approachable terms, what is a presidential pardon? We hear the term thrown around a lot, and it seems like occasionally there are also misconceptions about this.
Yeah, so there definitely are. Presidential pardon is actually a range of possible things, but at its fullest extent, a pardon forgives an offender for the crime that they committed. That's the most common way it's practiced. It's usually someone who's already served their sentence, but the pardon sort of removes the conviction from his record, removes any sort of consequences that remain. So if he's still suffering from some civil rights deprivations, like he can't own a gun or can't get certain licenses, those go away along with the conviction. The president can also pardon people before they've been convicted or even before they've been charged with anything. And if he does that, then by getting rid of any sort of criminal consequences for the person's actions, that can prevent them from going to prison. And if the person is in prison and in the middle of the sentence, the pardon would free them. The pardon can also be something less than that. It includes the power to commute a sentence, so you're not overturning the conviction, but you are shortening the sentence, maybe letting them go earlier or immediately. There's also the power to remit fines. If you had to pay a fine, the president can make them pay you back. Important limits on this, though, are that the president only has this power with regard to federal offenses, and it has to be something you've already done. So the president can't pardon you in advance and give you sort of a free pass to commit crimes that then won't be crimes. Finally, there is an exception for impeachment because the Constitution makes the impeachment process separate from the criminal justice process. So if someone's being impeached, the president can't do that, can't use the pardon to interfere with or overturn the result of an impeachment.
Can you clear up for us just a little bit, what exactly is the state of being impeached, and how does that relate to being fired from a job or having given a vote of no confidence?
Sure. So the impeachment process is, people talk about impeachment to refer to the whole process, but impeachment's just the first part. So the House of Representatives, by a simple majority vote, can impeach any executive or judicial officer of the federal government, and that's kind of like indicting someone. Basically, the impeachment is an accusation, and so if the majority of the House votes to impeach, then you are impeached, but that just means you're on trial in the Senate, and the Senate is the decision maker. You're on trial in the Senate. The Vice President presides over the Senate, but if the President is impeached and on trial, then the Chief Justice of the United States presides. And if a two-thirds majority of the Senate votes to convict, then you're convicted. You're removed from office at that point. Unless you are no longer in office, that's a whole other chapter of my last book. Can you impeach people after they've left office? But impeachment, again, just refers to the accusation. It's like the indictment.
Ah, I see. So not immediately in and of itself a proven thing, just an accusation.
Exactly.
It was like Clinton, for example, did not get removed from office, but was impeached, correct? Or am I misremembering that?
Censured, I believe.
Yes, yeah. Clinton was impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached. Neither of them were convicted. So it's a blight on the record. I don't know anyone who would invite an indictment and say it's no big deal. But without being convicted, he wasn't found responsible for whatever it is he did.
Have we seen a successful full realization of the impeachment process from a president? I can't think of one.
Not of a president. The only people convicted under the federal system have been judges.
And going back to this concept of pardons, we're interested in learning a little bit about your personal story. I believe some of your first published work on this concept occurred in 1996 during your time with the Yale Law Journal, or you wrote for the Yale Law Journal in this regard. When did you first begin investigating this question, and what originally inspired you to do so?
So I was a law student at Yale, and I was taking a criminal procedure class, and people make fun of Yale sometimes, Yale Law School, for being overly theoretical. And sometimes that's a fair accusation. But so, for instance, in our criminal procedure class, we were talking about presidential pardons, which is not really an important part of criminal procedure in the ordinary course of things. But the professor had some theories, and we were talking about the whole structure of the Constitution. And, okay, great, that's how it works in practice, but how is it in theory? That's what we really wanted to know. So we're talking about pardons. And I raised my hand, and I said, can the president pardon himself? And the professor thought about it for a second and said, I don't know. Why don't you look into that? So that weekend, I went to the library and I read a bunch of stuff, and I came back on Monday and I said, well, I did some research and we can't say for sure, but I think the better argument is that he can't. And he said, well, that sounds interesting. Why don't you write something up? I'll call it an independent study. You get a couple credits for it. Maybe you could get it published somewhere. So I spent the next weekend doing a rough draft of that, submitted it to the Yale Law Journal, got rejected. Asked the professor, should I send it around to other places? He said, well, law reviews, the way that works when you publish is, as a student, it's kind of hard to get published. Send it out to 100 places. You'll probably get 100 rejections, but who knows? Maybe you'll be lucky. You'll get 99 rejections. Before I did that, I resubmitted it to the Yale Law Journal, and they decided to take it on the second try. One of the main concerns about publishing it was that it seemed like a ridiculous thing to even think about, right? Like, why would a president how could that ever happen? This was in the Clinton administration. It was before Whitewater really got heated up. It was before people started asking about the self-pardon in the Clinton context. So my first task was just sort of making it seem relevant. So I talked about Nixon, and Nixon had asked his lawyer about it, and his lawyer said that Nixon could, if he wanted, pardon himself, and some of the others in the administration said he couldn't. So it was talked about then. Some people speculated about it a little bit at the end of the George H.W. Bush presidency, which back then was not that far in the past, when he pardoned all of the Iran-Contra defendants after he had lost the election. And some people thought maybe he'll pardon himself. But it was, they made fun of it. They said, this is kind of out there. And what I think is most important about this, and I continue to say this, is the fact that it seemed unlikely, the fact that it seemed out there, is exactly why it needed to be written about then. Mm-hmm. Because now you see this, fast forward to 2018, President Trump says he can pardon himself. Now everyone's talking about it, and no one can make the arguments that they have about self-pardons without thinking about Trump. And if you don't like Trump, you don't want him to be able to pardon himself. And if you do like Trump, you do want him to be able to pardon himself. And the Constitution doesn't care if you like Trump or not. Either presidents can pardon themselves or they can't. So really the only time you can get the real analysis, get the real answer to the question, is when it's purely hypothetical. And at that time it was. And so I wrote at the time what I thought was the best argument against self-pardons being constitutional. It was sort of a curiosity out there for many years. And then a few years ago, in 2012, I wrote a book that looked at a bunch of these sorts of questions. Can the president be impeached while he's after he's president? Can you prosecute a sitting president? Can the president pardon himself? What about Section 4 of the 25th Amendment for disabled presidents? There's a loophole in term limits where Obama or George W. Bush could come back into office. Looking at sort of crazy things like that, but again, with the idea of looking at it when it's not happening so that we can figure out what the right answer is and not what the politically preferable one for us is. The book came out in 2012, and the argument about self-pardons, I added some arguments against them. I also looked at the other side. So the book gives both sides of the argument on it. But again, in 2012, it still all seemed hypothetical. So I'm glad that I said what I had to say before I knew whether I whether I wanted the president to pardon himself or not.
Absolutely. And that book is Constitutional Cliffhangers, a legal guide for presidents and their enemies.
So it's interesting you spent so much time laying the groundwork and asking these questions in a hypothetical bubble, kind of. And now we're seeing maybe the first example of a president where these questions are pretty relevant because of potential dealings before he was president with his very complex business network and things like that maybe haven't quite been in play in the way that we're seeing now. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, and so the book tries to sketch out these sort of hypothetical scenarios just to illustrate, just to make it more lifelike, give some color to it. And a lot of the things that I tried to put in there, I was thinking about, like, if this happened, what would have to happen before a president would pardon himself? It would have to be a really weird situation. So that's part of the question: is when would it happen? What would it look like? And I can't see the future, but I think that the book holds up pretty well. In the chapter on can you prosecute a sitting president, it sort of, I don't know, it resonates a little bit with what's been going on this last year and a half. The self-pardon chapter, similar things. The one on 25th Amendment, which people are talking about. So when I wrote this book, I had to try to convince people one of these things might happen someday. It would be good if we thought about them now. And then within 6 months of Trump coming in, we had 3 of the 6 chapters in the news, 4 if you count the people saying that he should impeach Hillary Clinton. And so, yeah, I didn't think any of this would be relevant anytime soon. I didn't know we would elect a president who'd try to hit for the cycle based on my book.
And what's one thing that is fascinating about various conversations we've seen regarding the concept of self-pardoning is, well, I'd like to go back to the earlier example you alluded to with Nixon briefly in some work. It was surprising to me, and I think to many of us, to learn that Nixon had reportedly asked his own legal team about this concept way back during his time in office. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure if he asked the lawyers or if he just said to the lawyers, what are my options, and they came up with that. Mm-hmm. But a pardon was definitely something that was important. And so the question was, if he's going to get a pardon, does he have to wait and get it from Ford if he resigns, or can he give it to himself, or maybe they wouldn't have even prosecuted him. We're not sure. So it was even then, even though it was very real at the time, mm-hmm. It was still hypothetical. And the lawyers said, if you pardoned yourself, the option was presented as you pardon yourself and then you resign, because just politically, there's no way that you could do that and avoid impeachment. Mm-hmm. Impeachment was already, the process was already rolling. That would have just accelerated it, and that would have been the end. And he knew it. He knew it would have been the end.
Can we jump back to Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution just to really go over and lay the groundwork of exactly what the Constitution says a pardon is?
Sure. So I can pull up my little copy of the Constitution here.
Awesome.
Article 2 talks about the presidency, and here we go. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. The president, ... shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. And that's it. That's all it says.
So everything else is just us kind of deciding.
Pretty open-ended.
And with that language, that pretty vague language, you get what I've seen described as one of the most king-like powers of the presidency. That's how it appears to me. I think that's pretty accurate. I can't remember where I saw that, but it just seems like a wave of the hand and all your sins are wiped away.
Yes, and it is one of the most king-like. And I think just sort of thinking about Trump and the pardon power, it's easy to see why it's very appealing to him, because it's the most king-like, or you could say the most CEO-like. He just sort of signs this paper, and he doesn't have to go through Congress. He doesn't really have any potential for a court reviewing it because under the so-called political question doctrine, the courts will not look at a pardon and decide if it was warranted or not. So it's unreviewable in court. And he just says it, and it happens. He doesn't even need a lot of people to sort of follow along. It's not like something he has to build support for. If he says, let this guy out of prison, they let that guy out of prison. So it's the closest thing, like you said, to what a king could do. And it is very tempting, I can imagine, for presidents to look at that and think about how they might use it.
And we know that traditionally presidents have not immediately entered office and began exercising this ability to pardon people. But correct me if I'm wrong here, did the current president, Donald Trump, as we record this, did he begin pardoning people earlier than in his time in office than other presidents?
Well, in recent history, there's been sort of a shift. Presidents have pardoned less recently than they did in the past, and they sort of waited till the end to do many of them. But it wasn't the earliest in a presidential term that a president had done it. It was unusual, but it wasn't unheard of. And in a way, that's actually a good thing, because the design of the pardon power, we talk about it being a king-like power, but remember, the president's not a king, and the whole reason to give the president this power instead of giving it to, say, Congress by a congressional vote, you give it to the president because the president is politically accountable. He's always politically accountable, even though he doesn't run for re-election for 2 more years. Even if he's in his second term and not going to be running for re-election, he's politically accountable to the whole country all at once. He's got political capital to spend. And that's where the framers of the Constitution wanted the power to reside. So if presidents do what President Obama did by waiting until after the election to commute all of those sentences and the disproportionate sentences for drug offenses. He'd been talking about it, but he didn't do it until after the election. Or President Clinton, on his last day in office, pardoning Mark Rich, pardoning Susan McDougal, pardoning Roger Clinton, his own brother, waiting until after the election when he's not at all politically accountable. Or President George H.W. Bush pardoning the Iran-Contra defendants, again, after the election. The president is supposed to be politically accountable. It's sort of this little loophole that he still has the power even when he's not, but that's not how it's supposed to work. So when presidents pardon early, that's good, because then that means that Congress can respond, and the voters can respond in midterm elections or in the presidential election.
All right, we're going to be right back with more from Professor Kalt after a quick sponsor break.
And we're back.
Professor Kalt, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just going to make a statement here that is what I believe to be true. My understanding is that much of law is based upon the previous findings and judgments that have occurred. Like the guiding principles of what is now law is from the past, right?
Yes, to the extent that we have precedent, we take those precedents seriously or are bound by them depending on what kind of precedent it is.
Is there any foundational case or precedent that has to do with this at all, a president pardoning himself?
Well, we don't have any case law directly on point on presidents pardoning themselves. The argument against self-pardons relies on a whole bunch of theories and doctrines that haven't really been tested either. It really is fair to say that if a president did this, it would be completely unprecedented. Now, let me back up a little bit. There are cases in the past of other people with pardon powers purporting to pardon themselves, mayors and governors, and those those cases are sort of obscure. They hadn't really been tested in court, and so we don't have any precedent from those either. But even if we did, the U.S. Constitution presidential pardon power is different, is distinct from any state or local pardon power.
What was Dr. Bonham's case?
So this was a British case back in the 17th century. And the issue in that case is, I would say, the power of Parliament over the king, and the power of the common law over the Parliament. So I don't know. It's sort of a fundamental case for judicial review. People think about it as looking at the ability of courts to strike down statutes or not. I haven't thought about it much in terms of the pardon power, but basically the principle of Bonham's case, what you'll see it's cited for is people will say, if there's a statute that Parliament passes, because this was an English case, and it's contrary to what have you, natural law or common right and reason was how they put it in that case, then the judges have to declare it void. And so again, this sort of spawned the concept of judicial review, a court looking at something that Congress has done or that a president has done. If it's illegal, then the court has to say so. They have to say what the law is, and if the law is that this statute is unconstitutional, then they're supposed to say so. The actual case was about, sort of a weird medical licensing issue back in 17th century England. So I'm not real up to date on what exactly was going on.
Oh, no worries.
With Dr. Bonham himself.
The Washington Post just cited it as a foundational case for possibly this subject.
And as we're speaking about some popular sources of media and news here in the U.S., Professor, earlier in May of 2017, you wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal about the 25th Amendment, and specifically Section 4, I believe. We mentioned it briefly at the beginning of our conversation today, but I was wondering if you could tell us and the audience what the significance of Section 4 of the 25th Amendment is in this conversation.
Well, Section 4 of the 25th Amendment is where the Sections 3 and 4 deal with presidential disability. If the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, then Section 3 allows him to say so and hand over power to the vice president. And then when he's better, he says, okay, I'm better now, and he takes power back. Section 4 is for when the president can't declare that he's disabled or won't, and it allows the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Then the vice president becomes acting president. It doesn't remove the president from office. And the president is still in office. He just is temporarily stripped of his powers, and he can say, I'm not disabled, either right then if there's a disagreement there, or if he's unconscious. Once he regains consciousness, he can say, I'm fine. If the vice president and cabinet disagree, then it goes to Congress, and Congress has to decide. But the deck is stacked very heavily in favor of the president. There needs to be 2/3 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate agreeing that he's unable to do his job before he loses. So it's really it's never been used. Section 3 has been used. President's going in for a colonoscopy. He's going to be unconscious for a couple hours. He hands over power to the vice president. That's happened 3 times. But Section 4 has never been used, and a lot of people look at it and think, oh, well, if the president is nuts, then the vice president and cabinet should say so, and then that'll remove him from office, but it won't. If he's lucid enough to contest the action, it would probably result in him getting his powers back within a few days, and now he'd be mad. So it's not I'm not sure how it relates to self-pardons other than the possibility that if they thought he was about to try to pardon himself, maybe they could invoke Section 4. I went and found the Washington Post piece you're talking about. I had read it before. Lawrence Tribe, Norm Eisen. It's one of these things, and I should say this in general. A lot of the discussion about presidential self-pardons gets these headlines, and it's not always the authors that say this. Sometimes it's just a headline oversimplifying. But the headline says, "No, Trump can't pardon himself. The Constitution tells us so." And you can find things that are equally certain of people saying, yes, Trump can pardon himself. The Constitution tells us so. And they're both wrong. The Constitution doesn't tell us one way or the other. We've got, it's Schrodinger's cat, right? We won't know until there's an actual case. Mm-hmm. And when and if it happens, a court will rule on it, then we'll know. All we can say at this point is, we don't know. The president can try. It might work. It might not. And we can say, here's what I would say if I were a judge. And I would agree with Tribe, Painter, and Eisen in this Washington Post piece, saying, I think the best reading of the Constitution is that the president can't pardon himself, but there are good arguments on both sides. And I found where they talked about Bonham versus College of Physicians. That was their source for the notion that you can't be the judge in your own case. I'm actually kind of proud that it didn't occur to me to link Bonham's case with self-pardons, because I think that's a very roundabout and obscure way to get to that point. One of the main arguments that the president can't pardon himself is that you can't be the judge in your own case. And remember, I said that it was about some obscure medical licensing issue. Well, it turns out that's the part of the case that they were drawing on, which is why it didn't even occur to it. It didn't even occur to me.
Isn't there also the notion that a pardon is inherently, the nature of it is that it's for someone else?
Yes. So that was the main argument that I added in 2012. A friend of mine in law school, when I was writing this original article, it was only 30 pages long. I couldn't put in everything I wanted. He said, you should argue a textual argument that the pardon is something that's inherently bilateral. It's something you have to give to someone else, not something you give to yourself. And I said, no, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't want to make room for that. Then 16 years later, when I'm writing it, it occurs to me, as I think about it more, that's not actually worth including. That's not just worth including. That's actually the best argument there is. All of this other stuff is sort of, well, like you can't be a judge in your own case. Courts will say you can't be the judge in your own case when they're ruling against you being the judge in your own case. But there are other instances where they allow all kinds of self-dealing, and they conveniently forget to mention that. But if you can find something in the text of the Constitution itself, that's the best kind of argument for me. That's persuasive to me. So with that argument, the idea is the argument that the president can pardon himself is it doesn't say he can't. It says he shall have power to grant pardons. And it says there's an exception for impeachment. It doesn't have any other exceptions. They say, well, if they wanted to make an exception, then they would have said, and they didn't. So he can do it. But there are limits inherent in what the definition of a pardon or granting a pardon is in itself. So, for instance, I mentioned before, you can't pardon someone for something he hasn't done yet. You can only pardon past acts. Doesn't say that anywhere in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Where do they get that from? Well, the courts are very clear that you can only pardon things that have already happened, but it's inherent in the notion of what a pardon is. So this argument is the same thing, that a pardon is, just by definition, something you give to someone else. And you can look at other words that have the same Latin root, perdonare, like donate or condone. Like you wouldn't say, I condone my own actions. That doesn't make sense. You wouldn't say, I'm making a donation to myself. It doesn't make sense.
If you said, pardon me, you're asking for others to excuse something that you have done, just in like a social situation. If I say, pardon me, Matt, for I have belched or something, Matt would say, of course, good sir, you know?
Yeah.
And stop belching in my direction.
Yes, that probably also has roots in merry old England too. But I think, in addition to the argument that a pardon is inherently something you give to someone else, and the notion that the courts disapprove of people being the judge in their own case, there's also a historical argument based on how the people debating the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, talked about pardon powers. They were worried about giving the pardon power to the president, and Edmund Randolph, one of the delegates, proposed, this is all recorded in James Madison's notes, Edmund Randolph said, well, we need to make an exception. We need to not allow presidents to pardon people for treason. And the reason, he said, was the president may himself be guilty. He said the traitors may be his own instruments. And so we can't let the president have the power to pardon these other traitors that he's a traitor along with. And James Wilson, another delegate later on the Supreme Court, responded. He said, if the president be himself a party to the guilt, he can be impeached and prosecuted. And everyone said, oh, yeah, that's right. And they voted and rejected Randolph's motion, and they didn't restrict the pardon power for cases of treason. And they didn't talk about self-pardons, but what this tells us is, first of all, if any of those people thought that the president could pardon himself, the notion that, well, if the president's guilty, we can just prosecute him, that wouldn't have been persuasive at all. And no one said that, so they must not have thought that the president can pardon himself. Additionally, if anyone thought the president could pardon himself, then they would have talked about restricting that, not saying he couldn't pardon traitors, but that he couldn't pardon himself. But they didn't. Did they say the president can't pardon himself? No. But I think that little piece of evidence shows that they thought that it literally went without saying that a self-pardon is not possible. I think that there is an argument on the other side of this, which is that the president is both the sovereign and a person, and so he can pardon himself because it would be Trump, the president, giving a pardon to Trump, the person, and so it's inherently bilateral that way. So, it's not a killer argument. Like I said, there are good arguments on both sides, but to me, it's a pretty persuasive one. I think it's the best argument against self-pardons because, again, it's in the Constitution. It's inherent in the definition of the word pardon itself.
Absolutely. But where does this lead us? We'll be back after a word from our sponsor. Going off our hypothetical pardon me example, let's go into the realm of speculation just a bit. Let's imagine that the current president or just any president does somehow successfully attempt this move. They successfully pardon themselves. What would happen afterward? What sort of impact would this have on the U.S. government, on the hearts and minds of the public? What kind of consequences or implications could we possibly expect if something like this were ever to occur?
Yeah, I think ultimately that's the most important question because just like impeachment, the pardon power exists in a political context. If the president thinks it's a good idea to pardon someone, then he does it, and that's why he has the power. And so thinking about how it would look in my own writing, I set up this hypothetical example of a president who has been accused of all these crimes, and there's some question as to whether you can prosecute them while they're in office. So he's running for he's in a second term. So there's an election going on, and it's very divisive. And the other party is saying the president's a crook, and if I get elected, the candidate of the other party says, if I get elected, I'm going to appoint this guy as prosecutor, and we're going to go after the president, kind of like what Trump was saying he would do about Hillary Clinton, although he didn't end up doing it. And that person wins the election. And the president has been saying all along, I didn't do anything wrong, and my people in my administration haven't done anything wrong. And so he waits until, again, he's not politically accountable anymore, and he says, well, I'll just read here. He says, for 10 months, these scurrilous accusations have paralyzed the country. We've been unable to work on the real problems Americans face. That problem was about to get worse. Enough is enough. With this pardon, I'm ending this expensive distraction. Right? He has the power to do this, and he's going to use it. So that's how the president, I think, most likely would frame it, that he's not forgiving himself for doing something wrong. He is preventing these runaway prosecutors from doing an injustice to him. That's how he would spin it. And a certain percentage of the country would probably go along with that. So politically, the question would be how many people would buy that line of rhetoric. I think it would be a scandalous enough act to enough people that the president would wait until he was on his way out of office to do it, especially if he couldn't be prosecuted while in office. That's an open question, too. But if you can't prosecute the president while he's in office, and you can, if you're the president, pardon someone who hasn't been charged with anything yet, then that sets up this potential. So on his way out of office, he pardons himself. If he's on his way out of office, then the political fallout is much less. So to answer your question, if the president's not on his way out of office, if they're pursuing him and he says, oh, I'm just going to pardon myself, I think the political fallout would be tremendous. I think the prosecutor who was pursuing him would not just say, oh, I guess I can't prosecute you then. He would challenge it in court because it's not clear that the president can pardon himself. Mm-hmm. It would be swiftly appealed up to the Supreme Court, I think, but it would be a divisive issue, and the people who agree with the president that he didn't do anything wrong would think it's great, and the people who disagree with the president and think that he's a crook would think that it's terrible. And I think there'd be a lot of people in the middle who would say, I don't know what happened if he's a crook or not, but I don't think that pardoning yourself is okay. I think, you need to not put yourself above the law. You need to let other people make that decision. And that takes us back to Nixon. I mean, talk about what would have happened if Nixon had pardoned himself. We can only speculate. But we do know what happened after Nixon resigned, and shortly thereafter, Gerald Ford, who came into office untouched by the whole Watergate scandal, he had very high approval ratings, and he decides he's going to pardon Nixon. And immediately, it's a very controversial decision, his approval ratings drop. Most of the data that I've seen suggests it cost him the election in 1976. 2 years later, he's running for re-election. Or not re-election, but to stay in office for 4 more years, and he narrowly loses. It was a close election, and if you look at the data, what people thought about that pardon cost him the election. Mm-hmm. So you can only imagine how much worse it would be if Nixon had done it himself. Ford said, we've got to move on, this is the right thing to do. If Nixon had said that, it wouldn't have been convincing at all. So politically, if the president's still in office, it would be throwing a bomb. If he's on his way out of office, it would be controversial, but he wouldn't be president anymore, so it wouldn't. It would be tabloid fodder, right? It would be cable news fodder, but it wouldn't have the same sort of political impact. I think everyone would just wait and see what the courts had to say about it.
But then on the flip side of the speculative world we're exploring here, what if a standing president or president on the way out attempts to self-pardon and that attempt fails? Wouldn't they still encounter the same enormous potential for backlash? Because I imagine a lot of people who are going back to what you said about the supporters thinking it's a good idea, the opponents thinking it's a bad idea, wouldn't a lot of people in the anti-administration side see that as a smoking gun, more or less, indicating some sort of truth to all the problems they had with that administration?
Well, I think they could look at that and say, see what kind of person this is. But I think the supporters would say what they've been saying all along. If they have supported him this long in saying that the accusations against him are false, they would probably go along for the ride there too. And that's an important thing about pardons that I think is overlooked a lot. I had a piece. I don't know if anyone saw it, but I liked it. It was in the New York Daily News a few weeks ago, where you hear people say this a lot, that a pardon is a declaration of guilt, and that accepting a pardon is an admission of guilt. And so you might have people saying, see, he pardoned himself. That means he's admitting he was guilty, but that's actually not right. That notion that a pardon is an admission of guilt, accepting a pardon is an admission of guilt, is taking this one line from this one Supreme Court case out of context and reading it into a completely different one and really missing the point. Presidents almost always use pardons to forgive guilty people who maybe don't deserve the punishment that they got. But presidents can also use the pardon power to exonerate people. And it's not the most usual use of it, but sometimes they do. President Ford pardoned Nixon for giving someone who was guilty. He also pardoned Tokyo Rose. She had been convicted of making propaganda broadcasts during World War II, and she was an American citizen living in Japan, and they said, she was broadcasting these terrible things. Turns out, 60 Minutes does a story. It turns out the case against her was based on perjury, and it was totally trumped up charges against her, and she was completely innocent. And 60 Minutes had this big story about it, and President Ford said, this is terrible. Let's do what we can to pardon her, and he did. Not because she was guilty. It wasn't a declaration of guilt, but because she wasn't guilty. And when she accepted the pardon, she wasn't admitting she was guilty. She was accepting it because she wasn't. And Trump himself just pardoned Jack Johnson posthumously, the boxer. Again, not because he was guilty but should be forgiven, but because he wasn't guilty. The case against him was bogus. So this notion that he won't do it because it would require him to admit guilt, I think is wrong. And people are missing the potential for a president to put it in the language that I had it in my book, where he says, I'm not guilty, I'm innocent. And these people are coming after me anyway, even though I'm innocent, but I have the power to stop that, so I'm going to use that power. That's what he would say. And so any political reaction would have to reflect that context. If the president was saying, I'm guilty, but hey, it's good to be the king, and pardon himself, that would be much more controversial, much more unacceptable, but I think also as a result, much less likely to happen.
So let's talk kind of an out there hypothetical strategy, Noel, that you were talking about earlier. Would it be possible for a sitting president to use one of the clauses to step down as president temporarily, accept a pardon from the person who is then president in that momentary timeline, and then step back in? Yes.
So I guess that's what you were referring to Section 4 of the 25th Amendment about. Yes, the president could do that. Now, it's important to make a distinction about whether such a pardon would be valid and whether such a pardon would be able to be done with impunity. Because if the president did that, and then presumably, once he's back, he pardons the vice president, quid pro quo, those pardons would be valid, right? When you're the president or when you're the acting president, you pardon someone, that pardon sticks. But you also can be impeached for that. And you can be prosecuted for it, too, if it's part of a criminal enterprise. So if I give the president $1 million in exchange for pardon and he pardons me, that pardon is valid, but we're both going to go to prison for the bribe. And because you can only pardon something that's already been done, if the pardon is criminal, you can't pardon yourself for pardoning yourself, right? The last one, they'll always get you for the last one. So yeah, the president could hand over power to the vice president. The vice president pardons him, hands power back. He returns the favor, or he could resign. That's basically what Nixon and Ford did. Nixon resigned. Ford pardoned Nixon. Ford didn't need a pardon, so there was no sort of quid pro quo there. If it's part of a corrupt conspiracy, then it would be punished as part of a corrupt conspiracy, even though the pardons themselves would probably stick. I don't think there's any question about that. There are some people who would say that a court would refuse to honor such a pardon, but based on the case law, I don't see that happening. I think it's also worth mentioning how this would play out. If you have a pardon, it doesn't actually mean anything unless someone tries to do something to you that the pardon says they can't. So if you have a pardon and they say, well, I'm going to prosecute you, you say, well, you can't because I have a pardon. Then they try to prosecute you anyway. Then the court has to decide whether the pardon is valid or not. If no one tries to pardon the president, he pardons himself or the vice president pardons him, and no one tries to prosecute him, then we don't know if it's valid or not because it doesn't matter. It's only when he tries to do something that would only be he'd only be able to do if the pardon were valid that we would find out. And there's a lot of things would have to happen before a president would get prosecuted. It's not just the self-pardon being a remote hypothetical. It's also the prosecution itself that was remote. So, I love talking about these hypotheticals, but it's also hard to imagine the vice president wanting to get his hands dirty in that way. I'm not saying that it would never happen. I'm just saying that the more things you add in that make it unlikely, the more hypothetical it is, the less instructive it is. It's hard to draw lessons from it.
Ford pardons Nixon. To me, that's like a backroom conversation where Nixon is like, no? That's how I see it. Why did Ford pardon Nixon knowing there would be political fallout? It seems like it was something he was like doing a favor for Nixon.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who think that Nixon made a deal with Ford. I'll resign and then you pardon me. And I think Ford was inclined to pardon Nixon because that's just the kind of guy that Ford was. He didn't think that we needed to continue beating up on Nixon. He thought that losing the office was punishment enough. All of that sort of stuff. And I don't think that Nixon really had any leverage over Ford. Like if he says, well, I'll resign, but only if you promise to pardon me, Ford, if he was answering honestly, he said, well, I was going to pardon you anyway. Why are you saying that? Or he could say, well, which he actually did say. This is all in his autobiography, and it's been reported in Al Haig's book. Al Haig came to Ford before Nixon resigned. Haig was Nixon's chief of staff, and said, "Will you commit to pardoning Nixon?" And Ford didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. And when he told his people later, they said, "Well, you need to be more clear. You're not committing to anything." So he called up Haig. He said, "I'm not committing to anything." But Nixon didn't have any leverage. He was going to get impeached and removed. He was going to have to resign anyway, pardon or no pardon. Did he really want a pardon? Sure. Was Ford going to pardon him anyway? Sure. But was there a deal? No, I don't think so.
I think what I was getting at was that it was more of a courtesy, and I'm wondering why the conversation now isn't like, well, of course, Pence will pardon Trump. Why are we talking about Trump pardoning himself when the precedent has kind of been that as a courtesy, your VP will pardon you anyway?
Well, I think maybe Pence would look at what happened to Ford when Ford pardoned Nixon and say, if I want to get elected in 2020 or whatever the next election is, if this happened, I would have to think seriously about whether to do this or not. And if whatever it is that he's pardoning Trump for is something that involves himself as well, then that would be politically difficult for him to do. Ford had the political space because he hadn't been mixed up in Watergate. he had the space to do that and not have it look like an inside deal. In the same way, when Bush pardoned the Iran-Contra defendants, that was controversial for that reason, because Bush was one of them. It looked like he was helping them out of a mess that he was in too. So a lot would turn on that. Is Pence involved in whatever he's pardoning him for or not? As far as courtesy is concerned, it's a political question. He would look at the polls and they would survey people, and he wouldn't have to decide right away. This all turns on the notion that the president is being prosecuted for something, though, and I think that's possible that a former president would be pursued by a prosecutor, but without knowing exactly what the case is and exactly what the dynamics of it all are, it's hard to say what Pence would or wouldn't do in that situation. Because if there's a smoking gun and he looks guilty and it looks bad, then a pardon would look bad. And if it looks like it's some technical thing or some disputable thing, and Pence wants the country to move on, and he thinks that he can sell that idea that this is about moving on, then maybe he would. But he would have to look at what happened to Ford and realize that unless he has 30 points of approval ratings to spare, he probably has to be real careful about that.
Because it's tantamount to political suicide, or at least it seems that's the way the average voter would look at a vice president, right? They would gaze unfavorably upon that, regardless of the circumstances that led to that decision.
Well, I think that's the main thing that's different between now and Watergate. You can talk about an average voter in the 70s, and we were still being governed from the center at that point. And now things are so polarized, and we've got two sides that have completely irreconcilable versions of reality. And so there isn't an average voter, really. Like there isn't anyone in the middle. So I'm not sure that the political suicide notion is something that translates exactly from the 70s. Mm-hmm. I mean, he would have to take that seriously. He'd have to look at what the polls say, but it would play out in a weirdly different way. The same with impeachment. Nixon didn't go until the Republicans turned on him. The Democrats were in control of Congress. It looked like they were going to drive the impeachment forward, but it wasn't going to be successful until and unless the Republicans turned against him. Well, that's the same situation now. You don't get 2/3 to vote to convict in the Senate unless both parties agree. But you don't have anyone in the middle anymore. And the Republicans have to pay attention to the Republican primary voters. And with that polarization, it's harder to paint a picture where something happens and everyone agrees that it's bad, like it was in the 70s.
And I'm having a hard time emphasizing how much I appreciate that point about polarization, because for everyone listening, regardless where you find yourself falling in your own personal, political, or ideological stances, the fact of the matter is that the public in general is increasingly polarized. And although precedent does exist, Professor Kalt, I think you make some fascinating, fantastic, and to some degrees disturbing points about the differences between previous decades and the age in which we live today. Before we conclude today's episode, Professor, we have a question for you that we're certain is on the minds of our fellow audience members here, and that is this. Where can listeners go to learn more about your work and to learn more about the concept of pardoning or self-pardoning specifically?
So I would recommend, if people are interested in my book, that Chapter 2 of the book is the most comprehensive treatment that I've produced on the self-pardon question. for 20 years, I was the only person talking about it. Most of the discussion in the last year and a half has drawn on the things that I've said, whether they cited them or not. I think the book is the best place to go. Just go to Amazon, type in my last name, Kalt, and Constitutional Cliffhangers, and it should come right up. I think they've sold out of the hardcovers, but the paperbacks are still available, and the ebook version is still there. If they want to read the original article in the Yale Law Journal, 1996, again, Google my name, Kalt, and Pardon Me, and SSRN. It'll come up there, and you can download the original article.
Awesome. Well, get out there on Amazon, find that book, check it out. By the way, Professor Kalt, you are all over just the Washington Post and the internet. When people are talking about this subject, you get a lot of calls, don't you?
I do. It's a nice change from 20 years of people thinking that it was ridiculous to even be talking about this. Probably my highlight was in the preface of the book. I talk about how I'm writing this book, and I'm at this reception, and I'm talking to this prominent legal thinker, and he asked me what I'm writing about, and I tell him, and he looks at me and says, "Why are you writing about that?" And fast forward to 2018, and he has a piece in the Washington Post about whether the president can pardon himself. So,
oh man, it's a little terrifying that you were on the right track,
but it's prescient as
Yeah.
well. And we would like to thank you again for being so generous with your time with us today and for correcting or clarifying some of the misconceptions regarding pardons in general that are so common in the U.S. and I would say in larger international context as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Please let us know further questions that you may have while you're listening to today's episode regarding the concept of self-pardoning. You can find Matt, Noel, and I on Instagram. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on our fan page. Here's where it gets crazy.
And boy, does it ever get crazy in that fan page.
Professor Kalt, do you have a Twitter that you'd like to plug here?
Yes, I'm on Twitter. I'm at Prof. Brian Kalt.
There you go. Prepare yourself for a lot of inquisitive minds.
Well, Twitter brings out the best in people, doesn't it?
Yes.
That is what I hear.
And that's the end of this classic episode. If you have any thoughts or questions about this episode, you can get into contact with us in a number of different ways. One of the best is to give us a call. Our number is 1-833-STDWYTK. If you don't want to do that, you can send us a good old-fashioned email. We are
conspiracy@iheartradio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.